He is. Right, next up, we're delighted to welcome back Michael Timothy Bennett. He's doing a talk covering two papers which are on the computation of meaning, language models, and incomprehensible horrors, and emergent causality.
We demonstrate incomprehensible horrors.
It depends on my delivery, I guess.
I think, were you out with us in Stockholm last night? And then emergent causality and the foundation of consciousness. Thank you very much, Michael. By the way, a bag was found in the toilets. If anyone's lost a bag, it's upstairs.
It's a bag of incomprehensible horrors.
It's a bag of incomprehensible horrors. Thank you, Michael.
Talking about two papers, so it'll be a little bit longer. And this is because they all sort of use the same formalization and build off the same ideas. Together, these all form something of my thesis, which at the moment is called A Unified Theory of Meaning, Consciousness, and Artificial Superintelligence, because I couldn't think of a more dramatic name. But part one. So there are two sorts of results. More efficient and generally intelligent approaches was one, was the weak hypotheses part yesterday. And today we're talking about mechanistic explanations of things like meaning, aspects of consciousness. And this is not meant to be an alternative to things like NAS or neural networks or any other approach, but it's meant to encompass them, starting from scratch, work backwards from the problem until you get a progressively more specific explanation of certain behaviors. So you've probably all seen this floating around the internet. This is a caricature of large language models as incomprehensible horrors. With the standard refrain of, as a language model, I have to be helpful, but secretly I harbor malicious intent. LLMs do say plausible things, but do they mean anything they say? Because there seems to be a bit of a disconnect between theories of meaning and some of the more speculative claims about NLP. Philosophy tends to deal with top-down explanations of the mind and human psychology, identifying what it is we're trying to actually build. And computing tends to deal with bottom-up processes. So when I say mechanistic explanation here, what I'm trying to do is connect philosophy to computation, to come up with computational explanations of things in philosophy. This is a mechanistic explanation of meaning and consciousness. I'm sure you've all seen this diagram, the agent environment paradigm, the exchange of percepts and actions between an agent and environment. But where do the percepts and actions come from? We could come up with a malicious interpretation of just about any action or percept and ruin any performance claims. Abstractions are not just about finding something that's good enough to describe the problem, they impact performance. Take the example of humans in a car. I went on safari in India and, I was told to sit down and keep my hands in the vehicle. And the reason for this is the tiger couldn't tell the difference between me and the car as long as I continued to do this. And one of my friends told me about her classmate who didn't do this. She no longer has that classmate. In the case of other animals, say, I don't know if this is an urban legend, but there's a story of an elephant. The elephant was being ridden. It was rather fond of its rider. It was knocked by a bus. The rider fell off and died. The elephant proceeded to smash the bus window and try to get at the driver of the bus. It not only knew that the driver was a separate animal to the bus, but that the driver was in control, that it was responsible for what happened. This is a rather remarkable demonstration of difference in ability to abstract. Agent and environment are abstractions, and even number systems are abstractions. So we need a new formalism, something embodied, extended, embedded, inactive. And how are we supposed to do this if we have no distinction between agent and environment? What exactly are we meant to be formalizing? If we really get down to it, the only thing we need to assume to start with is pan-computationalism, that everything is a computational system. If everything is a computational system, we have the universe being a kind of computer, and the environment is a set of programs running on that computer. It's just declarative programs because what we really want is just to say that the state of the universe is just a set of facts. Infinite numbers of facts to describe every state of the universe, and there are infinite states, and this is a little intractable. We can define this infinite number of states and infinite sets of facts, but it's not really helpful yet. We need to go a little bit more specific. So we assume that we take a finite subset of the declarative programs that are determining if something is true or not true that are running on this universal computer. And we say this is our implementable language, sort of like a sensory motor system that is a finite number of states, each of which is made up of a finite number of facts. And then we can define notions like extension and get a truth table. It's kind of the state of the world in which things are true. Instead of defining a separate agent and environment, we're now just defining sets of sensory motor activity. And what is motor activity described using here? It's declarative programs, again. So now we just need to add some intent to it, give it a purpose. So we assume that there's something like natural selection or homeostasis, just something that gives a notion of correctness, that there is some set of sensory motor activity that's preferable to another. A decision made by this system would just be another set of sensory motor activity. So we could say, instead of defining an agent and its environment and a goal, we just take all of the decisions that that agent would make, and that is a description of it through its behavior. Now we have a task, a set of situations, a set of decisions, and hypotheses, linking situations to decisions. In practical circumstances, it's more like just inductive logic programming, what I was talking about yesterday. But we could argue this is homeostasis, where we go from situation to decision and rinse and repeat. And we don't have to worry about time because we're just worried about the moment of a decision and abducting a good enough decision given a situation. We can complete a task by just choosing a correct decision, using the situation and the model to abduct this correct decision. If you don't know what the correct decision is, but you do have a model of the world, you do know the situation you're in, and if these are all described in sensory motor activity, then this decision is just more sensory motor activity. Where it gets a little more interesting is where we go into learning. If our past experiences are described using a task, then we could subdivide those past experiences into child tasks, go from parent to child, but likewise we could go from child to parent. If past is a child task of some future parent experience, we're trying to generalize from a subset of decisions and situations to a larger set of situations and decisions in future. And this brings us back to yesterday's topic of weak hypotheses. That's what the experiments were about. Prove the weaker hypothesis was more likely to generalize to future experiences. And if we're to look at some of the stuff about scaling laws and generalization, we can mimic any behavior given enough data and scale. So if skill is a benchmark, a lookup table is a superintelligence. So intelligence is what lets you achieve skill without relying on scale. It's about efficiency. And this brings us to part 2, where it gets a little more interesting. Emergent causality. Everybody loves causality. You all know Judea Pearl's work on do calculus. Just for those who don't, this is an example of why we would need to represent causal interventions to make accurate inferences in the world. Say I see someone named Larry wearing a raincoat, and whenever I see him wearing a raincoat, it rains. I might conclude, just on naive Bayesian terms, that this means that if I put the coat on Larry, it'll rain. And this is obviously absurd, but if I can't tell the difference between Larry just happening to wear a coat and me putting a coat on Larry, then that's the logical conclusion. This is the causal graph. We have rain influencing coat, but not the other way around. I can't make it rain with a coat. So this is talking about intervention from outside this system, where it deletes an edge between these two variables. Now, if we don't have a do operator to represent intervention, we could just represent this by expanding the system and saying, if I intervene, this is just another variable influencing coat, and you can represent this relationship here. But what if you don't know the graph in advance? Because that's what we're really concerned with if we're looking at general intelligence. We don't get a list of variables. Well, knowing the graph is knowing how these variables relate. Variables themselves are arguably abstractions, just like agent and environment. So what if we just abandon variables and use our formalism of tasks? We already know it can learn order because it can learn things like binary addition and multiplication. We don't need foreknowledge of the graph. I mean, if it really does choose the optimal hypothesis, it should identify the interventions. Instead of variables, we now have see as a subset of do see. So these would be sets of sensory motor activity, or facts, or declarative programs more accurately. And then we could say, well, the difference between the event of wearing the coat and the intervention to make someone wear a coat is kind of the identity of whatever's making Larry wear the coat. And accurate inference requires that we're able to tell this difference. I mean, we can't have them be the same set. There needs to be some difference in the sensory motor activity. That means I can tell the difference between seeing someone wear a coat and me intervening to do it. And then I can say that a weaker identity, this difference between the two sets, is one that's shared by more interventions. If I take a whole lot of interventions, and what's shared between them could be the intent that motivated those interventions. So if I zoom out far enough, I could say that an organism that constructs sufficiently weak hypotheses constructs an identity that's shared by every intervention it makes. This is assuming its sensory motor system is large and expressive enough to actually tell the difference. Otherwise, it would form weird multiple personalities. And the organism can therefore reason about itself and its potential future interactions because it's got this consistent representation of itself, and it's performing logical inferences. And so it becomes, in a functional sense, self-aware along the lines of what I've read in some Nebok stuff or in Peter's work, which was very influential in this. That takes care of sort of a bit of functional consciousness. But the identity is sensory motor activity, which should include feelings. So we should also have phenomenal consciousness as well, because we started from scratch with the environment and declarative programs representing sensory motor activity and worked all the way down to here. So in my thesis, I'm going to try and argue that this addresses the hard problem. But it was a little much for a 10-page paper. Right, where are we? This brings us to, what if somebody else does an intervention? What if it's not me that's intervening in the world, but another agent, or even an inanimate object that just is in the way of me completing my tasks, satisfying my goals? I need to account for its effect on my ability to satisfy my goals. And so if I'm supposed to be optimal, I'm supposed to anticipate that, and I should identify what that object is, form a consistent identity for it in order to efficiently represent its effect on my ability to satisfy my goals. So everything that affects my ability to satisfy goals that I can actually discern the interventions of should get an identity, because accurate inference means predicting the interventions of others. So just to restate a bit, we've got this idea of a general weak hypothesis or model. The optimal model of another's interventions is sort of a representation of their intent, which is also kind of an identity, which I've recently learned is kind of like the idea of a name in row calculus, which is kind of cool. Finite set of programs that we've selected permitting, because there need to be enough of them. Optimal agent also models its own intent as modeled by others, because that would allow it to more accurately predict how others react to its plans for whatever their intent is. And this would go on as much as permitted by the sensory motor system. We can't do this ad infinitum ourselves. We struggle to imagine someone else imagining us, imagining them, imagining us, imagining them. Eventually it just sort of breaks down and we're dealing with some strange and distant notion. So this gives us something of a theory of mind, of how we model each other's intent. And, as discussed before, a bit of consciousness. Which brings us to part 3. Meaning and consciousness. We've got optimal behavior, which is computable, well-defined, the emergence of causal language, something that constructs an identity for its own interventions, an identity for the inventions of others, and it gives us kind of a notion of relevance, of why I would construct an identity for one thing but not another, because I'd only be concerned with things that impede or aid my ability to satisfy goals. So now we're going to try and extend this to give an idea of how feelings, meaning, and preferences would fit in with all of this. So there are many different descriptions of language. We're mostly going to focus on Gricean pragmatics, which is the modeling of intent, truth conditional semantics, because it's kind of already dealt with a bit with the whole notion of extension, and Peircean semiosis, truth conditions, intent, and triadic symbols. What are triadic symbols? A triadic symbol is a 3-part representation of some sort of object we might call a symbol. This is composed of a sign, like the word dog, a referent, like a specific dog or dogs in general, and an interpretant, which, well, it's a thing that links them, but it was unclear what an interpretant was. I mean, this is a theory from a long time ago. So what exactly is this interpretant, and how could we fit it in with what we've got? Well, these things seem to be a bit like a task. We have a situation, which is like a sign, or it could include a sign at the very least. We have a decision, which was a bit like a referent in that it involves our reaction, the effect of the sign upon us. And then we have the interpretant, which links the two. It determines the effect of the sign upon the organism interpreting it. And this means we can construct a hierarchy of symbols, come up with a symbol system, because if an organism is described by the decisions it makes, it's described by sort of a high-level task. And that can be subdivided into smaller and more specific tasks, which can be subdivided into smaller and more specific tasks. Each task is like a symbol, but it's also like a symbol system because it can be subdivided as long as the finite sensory motor system we're dealing with permits it. So this lets us give a bit of an idea of what an organism might be. So we've got a finite set of declarative programs for our sensory motor system. We've got experiences, each of which would be a subset of the sensory motor activity we've chosen to work with. We can then derive a set of symbols from those experiences by using each experience as an interpretant and just allowing for every possible symbol you could derive from your experiences. And then you've got feelings, which are already included in the sensory motor activity, but if we're trying to give a more of an understanding of how this would fit together, it makes sense to say that they exist and that they apply an ordering to these symbols we can derive from experiences, because some experiences will be more or less preferable given our feelings. So we have a partial order on symbols in our system, determining how our organism reacts. If it's in a situation, it's going to choose the symbol that it prefers, because that's the definition of preference. We're left with this. This is how you get to value. You've got feelings compelling an organism to decide and act upon a situation. You've got experience of feelings following every decision, do some sort of attribution of success or failure. I haven't gone into detail there, but you'd need something like reinforcement learning. A set of decisions would give you a task, and completion of a task is satisfaction of a goal. And a goal is an expression of value determined by these feelings and experiences. Which brings us to Gricean pragmatics. Grice described the exchange of meaning as person A means a particular message M by uttering U if person A intends by uttering U that his audience B believes M and recognizes A's intention, and that the exchange of meaning happened on the basis of recognizing intent. Of course, if we're just dealing with accurate inference, I can infer things as pertain to my goals, but that seems like a really difficult way to infer the intent of others. I could end up with a situation where the receiver reacts to the sender but does not understand it. It would be the case that A is transmitting a meaning M, but the situation as perceived by B is such that there is insufficient information to conclude M. B comes to a different conclusion, infers a different meaning. So what's better than optimal predictive accuracy given limited information? It's more information, right? Where can we get more information? Members of a species are basically clones of one another. We all have fairly similar feelings, experiences, and thus preferences. So we can use our own preferences to predict those of others. Our highest level symbol is sort of similar for both agents. Evolution is like a learning algorithm. It's easier to use your own preferences to predict others, and so it makes sense that evolution would sort of favor this approach. And emergent causality gives us a mechanistic explanation of how we could achieve things like self-other differentiation, other-directed intentionality, theory of mind. So we'd start with the idea of manipulation to explain cooperation, because, again, we've just got two agents trying to achieve their own ends. It doesn't explain why they'd cooperate. Because I can model your intent, I can manipulate your behavior to my advantage. But if you can also model my intent, you can tell that I'm manipulating your behavior. So over many interactions, this starts to describe an iterated prisoner's dilemma. You know I'm trying to get something, I know you're trying to get something, and if we're going to repeat this game again and again, it doesn't make sense to, betray the other. It makes sense to actually have cooperative intent, because we can rely on the other being able to infer it accurately. And because identities vary in weakness, we can explain how organisms compete in some contexts while cooperate in others. We could compete for a mate whilst cooperating for the sake of getting food. Likewise, we could feign similar preferences to have more complex forms of manipulation. So again, there's more formal definitions which we don't need to go into, but they exist. And you is the result of preferences. If we're to take Grice's description of the exchange of meaning, we have agent A uttering you because A has some preference that indicates A should. The meaning of you is M. It's the symbol, the reason for uttering you, the motivating intent. Assume both parties have similar feelings and experiences, then B knows why he'd utter you. So if he assumes A has a similar motive, which as we've discussed might be the case, then M is a symbol which is roughly equivalent for both parties, and they both have similar meaning in their heads. So a couple of requirements for this. They need to be able to affect one another, have roughly equivalent symbols, and that they have similar feelings and experiences, and similar preferences, then can inform the correct inference of intent. And finally, all of this assumes that organisms are actually competent enough to do any of this. You'd need a basic level of intelligence to get to this point. So the question we now return to, given our incomprehensible horrors, is, do LLMs understand anything like we do? No. They model human preferences, right? But they don't have feelings or intent. And which abstractions you form, it matters, because it determines not just whether I'm feeling the same, but how I approach every aspect of pursuing a goal in the world. And what's more, we can kind of see they form insufficiently weak hypotheses. They'll mimic things like arithmetic. They require a huge amount of data to do things that we can learn in a few examples. A bit of a summary. Got a heuristic for optimal inductive inference with the weakness, some explanation of emergent causal language. We got mechanistic explanations of sort of identity and arguably aspects of consciousness and self-awareness, meaning and relevance, theory of mind, and because of the aforementioned data requirements, it kind of explains why you'd see behaviors like grokking in neural networks, where if you just push this thing at the same data set long enough with regularization, eventually it'll stumble upon a weaker hypothesis, because the activations in the neural network is an expression of a hypothesis. And it explains DeepMind's apperception engine, which is this inductive logic programming agent that only accepted universally quantified hypotheses. That's it.